James Hillman concludes his talk on need, want, and desire. Robert Bly then speaks on 4 ways of descent. Responding to a question from a therapist, Bly, Hillman, and Meade give 3 views on the potential virtues and dangers of therapy as an aid to the descent process.
So this stretching or reaching out with your appetite is a very important part of where your desire is. And our fuck up with appetite in general in the culture about being such a fat culture, there's hardly any culture, developed culture as fat as ours in this century anyway, where fat and dieting is a major problem in the culture, must have something to do with frustrated and blocked and distorted appetite, which is frustrated and distorted desire and spirit. It's as if to say inside the fat body is a puer, wanting more, and there's no understanding of how to get that more. Fat is the substitute for a spiritual more. Or the fat is a representation of the way our more in our culture appears as material fat. So corporations are always talking about trimming down, cutting the fat, getting leaner. Why do they use all that language? They want to get something activated. See, I got into this puer thing myself because I was over there in Zurich studying and being trained to be an analyst and so on and so forth, and I was so full of all this stuff, fire and running around in the stars and so on, and that I was told all those things that you just said. Not able to take on the responsibilities of being a man, just flighty, da-da-da-da-da, you know, and therefore I had to get grounded and give up all my whatever it is, you know. But that is a vicious, castrating idea, and it comes out of the... Because when you give that up, that is not the way you become a man. That's the way you become an old man. It's the way you become a senex, which is the opposite side of the puer, the old man. Senex was a Latin word for the old man. There was a figure of this old man. In other words, grounded, responsible, committed, all those good, heavy-duty Protestant words that therapy loves, and related, committed, responsible. You just feel it. Feel those words. What does that do? It's like the sergeant telling you to get up in the morning. You know, it's heavy. And what happens to desire when that happens? Now, so the problem is how to be loyal and faithful and committed to that spirit. How to encourage it, protect it, value it. That's the crucial thing. Not to change into another spirit, but to be loyal, protective, fathering, careful, attentive, loving to that boy who's wild and wants to fly. I'm talking about being loyal and committed to your own freak fire. All right?
Good, the freak fire.
Okay.
Especially true of you.
Yeah, especially true of me, right.
But that's a wonderful idea, to be loyal to that fire instead of trying to kill it or switch it or turn it.
And the very fact that you bring in loyalty and protection and carefulness, you're already incorporating those qualities that they say you should be responsible and so on and so forth. You are already being, integrating, as they like to use the word, that other side that is, that you get it, yes? Yes. Okay, now, a little more about this desire, because that's the hard one. And I think about it a lot and don't know quite how to describe it. D.H. Lawrence says desire is holy. And I think it has a lot to do with imagination, and this is something we may talk about. I think that part of the block of our desire in the culture is because our imagination is blocked in the culture, so that we don't have wings of desire. We can't desire Desire has something to do with the impossible, with further, beyond. And that requires imagination. So the poets that we quote often, like Lawrence or Blake, are poets, or Rumi, are poets in which imagination and desire are so closely connected. They're poets of imagination and poets of desire. Now, if desire is connected with our images, if images evoke it, and it does in your own mind, why does everybody put a pin-up on the wall of the garage? You know, you go to a service station, you get a piece for your windshield wiper, and you go inside and there's a whole set of pin-ups. The desire is kept alive in some way by these images. An old idea of course, desire is in the penis, erections, which go up. And the old idea of what made an erection go up was that the penis had a tube in it of air. And the imagination of the mind went down through the body into the penis and lifted it.
That's nice.
And Leonardo da Vinci, when he made anatomical drawings, and he did, among all the other things he did, fortifications and airplanes and all these things that he did anatomical drawings, and he did a cross-section of the penis. So there's this cross-section of the penis, you can see it, and it has two holes through it. One hole was the urethra where fluid went through, and the other hole, which he saw in his anatomical dissections or fantasies, was the hole where the air went through. Wonderful. And which would inflate and inflate, by the way. That's another bad word in psychotherapy. You're inflated. Well, how the hell are you ever going to get off the ground if you're not inflated?
5 minutes, James. 5 minutes.
So, that's one of the ways the imagination touches desire, or one of the examples of imagination touching desire. And we must, and I say that earnestly and heavily, we must do something about our imaginations if we're going to move our desires. And I think that ties with what you said, Michael, earlier about art being very important. And I don't mean just going to museums and looking at images. I mean letting your fantasies move, your daydreams and your night dreams, and letting yourself imagine without so much restriction and control over your imagination. Doesn't mean you do your imagination, but you have to enjoy your imagination. Another aspect of desire was an old Greek word called pothos, or longing, or nostalgia. When Alexander the Great, who conquered the whole world before he was 33 and is a tremendous example of puer ambition, when he got to the bank of a river, he would sit there outside of his tent alone, longing to cross the river. And that feeling was called pothos, or the longing to go beyond, to go farther than you can see, into a horizon that's still farther. That's the romantic feeling. Now you can see, if you live only that and you just move from thing to thing to thing, of course it would be, as you said up there, irresponsible and not a real man and so on and so forth. But the real man comes in being able to organize around that ambition, which Alexander did. Yeah. In other words, he didn't squash the ambition or just set off alone on a horse. He built something. He structured it. He gave it careful attention. Mm. He fathered it. Mm. He matured it. All those good words. But he didn't deny it. So he let his imagination lead him, or his imagination evoked his desires. I think that's what I want to say. Lovely.
What I want to do in this little session, James has been talking about the value of the ascension and how to honor that fiery part of yours, that wing part that goes. And in a heavy capitalist society, that is not loved. You got to go to graduate school immediately. So, and they got special wing clippers there. And is that right? So, therefore, that's a very important part of it. And if you look at this story, you can see that he's got his wings on well at the moment he gets off the horse and picks up the feather. What I want to do now is talk about not the ascent, but the descent. So, in our story, the descent is contained, these stories can be expanded infinitely. Remember when Michael said, and then the horse said this, and then he went or the king said that, then he went and wept. At that point, the horse of power will come and say, what are you weeping about? Mm-hmm. So it's that moment in there of that weeping. So this is what I'd like to do now. I'm going to give you 4 ways of descent. And the first one we'll call the way down and out. And you remember there is a wonderful book out of print for years called The Way Down and Out. I looked it up recently out of Cornell University Press, and it describes how the French poets like Baudelaire and all the rest of them took the way down and out. It's also part of the phrase of Orwell's book, Down and Out in Paris and London. Now, Orwell came from the middle class of England, which was often used for empire service. And at a certain point, when he decided he didn't want to be elevated in that way anymore, he decided to go down and out. And he worked in kitchens in big hotels in Paris and London. That's exactly the same movement that the boy in the Wild Man story makes when he gets a job in the kitchen of a castle. So this is kitchen work in the basement, the down and out. There's something in us that does not want an ascension all the time. So we're talking about breathing in and breathing out here. Now, when the moment comes for going down, it can be very dramatic. Something in you cannot stand this damn ascension all the time from school to graduate school and on to job and promoted. Can't stand that. And it can't stand the flatness either of being at a certain level and keeping going. So a man that I knew was a very successful advertising man in Los Angeles. He had a very nice family and a very big house in Los Angeles. And one morning he woke up on his lawn with a shotgun pointed at his head, which he intended to use. Now, that was the moment his descent began. And he quit his entire job and took a job as a service person in a kind of a commune or a study center. And he was still doing that 10 years later when I met him. And he was on the way down and out. And the way down and out often involves a drop in social status. And that is why sometimes this work happens better in places where you're not artificially held up by your position or your job or your suburb or something like that. In certain cultures, you can go up and down pretty fast. And there's something in you, this is one of the routes to take the way down and out. And it involves dropping down into distress, poor clothes, having nothing, being alone, having cheap rooms, all of that material. And then the people know perfectly well when you're down there. They never open a subway. They don't keep a subway door open for you. They can see you coming. And you try to go to a hotel, they close the door just before you get there. So people know when you're down and out, and they don't want you around at that point. That's a part of the being down and out. It's all fine. So we could go on a long time about that one. And what's said in a high culture like this, a high economic culture like this, is that we oftentimes found it difficult to drop into a lower social class to do this. The second way we're talking about
is crazy, in fact.
What?
In some cases, you have to go crazy.
Yep.
One of the signs of schizophrenic, one of the social signs of schizophrenia is change of class downward. And moving into the inner city.
Can you understand what he said? That many people end up in an asylum or a mental institution? That's their way of going down and out.
Right.
And when they come out, it's something else. Something has changed in them. Second way is to take the road of ashes. Now, in the road of ashes, the social status doesn't change particularly. This is described in fairy stories when you have Cinderella, the one who sits by the fireplace, and Askiladen in the Norwegian, Ash Boy. And usually, you see, when we read those fairy stories now, we think that, and then they were told to go sit by the fire and rake the ashes. We think that's a punishment. But if you examine the story, the one who sits by the ashes is the lucky third boy and the lucky third girl. See, the two older ones are paralyzed and stratified by the intensity of the father who wants something from them. And sometimes the third son is protected from that energy, do you understand, by the two older brothers. And so he's more fluid and able to move, and therefore his reward really is to sit by the fire in the ashes. So in this route, you think of the ashes in your life. How old are you before you begin seriously to think about what you wanted to have achieved by the time you were 35? I'm going to be a stock car racer. I'm going to be a genius. I'm going to have the Nobel Prize by the time I'm 35. I'm going to marry the most beautiful woman in the world. I'm going to do these. These are all dreams you had in high school. And then examine yourself to see how many of those dreams have turned to ashes. And then ask yourself how many of your relationships have turned to ashes. How many of your jobs have turned to ashes? That's that quality of ashes. And it's so important. It's almost never done before 35. And after 35, there's no support for you to do it. Because your friends always want you as you were. Tell us a joke. What are you so depressed about? Another image I think is nice is that when we were in high school, we had a stove, you know, and a really good draft on it. And you could throw in your friends, whole nights, all your sexual stuff, throw it in the fire. Man, it burns wild. Woo! I mean, 4 o'clock in the morning, still burning wonderfully, you know. And you do this a while, and then one day, maybe 33, you walk in and you notice it doesn't take such big chunks anymore. But an hour and a half is enough now. But there's ashes in there. You can't get your big chunks in anymore. And then you have to go and start cleaning out the ashes. And I'll tell you something, you got to go to the hardware and buy yourself a little black shovel. And then you start taking out the ashes from your stove and it falls on the floor. Then you can see your own boot marks, by the way, in the ashes when you start taking it out. And then it's very interesting. Take the ashes and feel them on your fingertip. How strange ashes are. And the interesting thing about ashes is that they get into your whorls and your fingertips, and you can take your own fingerprints with your ashes. You'll know much better who you are when you let yourself go into this study of the ashes. This is the ashes time. And we don't know exactly when it should take place, but there was 2 ashes time. For example, I'll tell you something I found out. In the old Viking times in Norway, the hall, the room they slept in was about as wide as that group there and about as long. And there were beds all the way around on these 2 walls where everyone slept. And the fireplace was a pavement down the center. And every family then came into that pavement to do their cooking. And the ashes were piled between the pavement and the beds. So there was a space of about 1.5 feet between the pavement and the ashes. Young men used to come and lie there for up to 2 years. And apparently they rolled in the ashes and they actually bit the cinders. They were called cinder biters. And the old men and the old women let them do that. They went into a lethargy, almost like a hibernation around 16, 17 for a couple of years. Do you understand how that is? How wonderful. You try to do that. You have a longing for that now. And you'll drop out of school. You'll end up in prison. The very same things that'll make you end up in prison is that same longing for lethargy. I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it anymore. I can't stand it anymore. I'm just going to lie down here. So there's something wonderfully intelligent about those old cultures in which they'd allow the young man a year or 2 of being a cinder biter and no one bugged him. We needed a time of lethargy around 16 or 17 and most of us didn't get it. Isn't that right? Now you're going to need another one. 35 somewhere in just about the time they're going to make you vice president is when you of the company. That's when you really need it. You need that time of ashes. You need to go and sit in the cinders in the kitchen and look at the ashes of your own life. And that's a wonderful descent. So I like that one very much, and maybe if we have a chance today, I will read a couple of the poems that I've been writing in the last 4 or 5 years for my father. And when you start to work with your own father, my father was alcoholic, when you start to work with your own family, then you'll feel what ashes are. Then you do that. You're no longer flying above it, you know. It isn't that you were born in some fantastic person and you just happen to get these shitty parents. That isn't it. You nose down, you put your nose down and you start to go through that stuff. Okay, the third way I'm going to talk about with that, the third face of it, you can call learning to shudder. And we're trying here to find ways in which this old work was done. And I noticed that one of the earliest stories in the Grimm brothers is a story about a boy who couldn't shudder. It's very interesting. They bring up ghosts. They get cut-apart bodies for him. He said, gee, oh, good-looking person. And, you know, they get, finally, it gets going, you know, and actual dead bodies come dropping down the chimney, and the legs are here, and the arms are here, and he said, are you here for tea? I mean, what's going on? So I won't tell you how that story ends, how he learns to shudder. Go and look at it yourself in Grimm Brothers. It's incredible. I don't understand it at all, but it's beautiful. So, learning to shudder, what does that mean? It means that the ashes here are learning how frail the human being is and the incredibly cruel things that human beings can do to each other. And when you see one of those, you shudder. If you want to see a movie on that, it's called Casualties of War. And the 4 men in the platoon, you know, in an actual event, captured, raped, and killed the Vietnamese girl. And there was one man in that, Michael Fox played it, who had already learned how to shudder. And when that happened, he shuddered and he wouldn't take part. And then there's an extremely ominous thing that happens, because these 4 guys who can't shudder are not men. They're boys. They're macho bullying boys. And they go up to him and they say, you're going to do that, huh? You're going to do that? You're not going to do that? You're not going with us? Let me tell you something, buddy. I had this happen to me often in school, in not quite so dangerous ways. What they're going to do with him is exile him out of the community of men. They're going to make sure, and if he doesn't go, they'll rape him to make sure he's exiled out of the community. Well, he doesn't go. He continues to shudder. Finally, a chaplain sits down next to him, and he tells the chaplain what happened, and it turns out they all got 4 years in Leavenworth. That Michael Fox character was able to shudder, and I'm just saying to you, that's part of the ashes thing. Do you understand how if you're up there too far and you see cruel events? Kitty Genovese was stabbed 14 times outside an apartment in Queens and nobody shuddered. The culture is being taught not to shudder. That's what the television things with murders are about. The average American child now has seen 14,000 murders on television. This is a culture teaching you not to shudder. So therefore, somehow, to be, you know, when you're with a woman and you don't know how to shudder, she's terrified of you. And men, friends, are terrified of you if you don't know how to shudder. So I'm just laying that in there. I don't know, I'm learning about it myself. Because some part of me has tried not to shudder because of my alcoholic father. Whatever it is, I'm trying to learn how to do that. The last image I'm going to give you for this, the fourth route in going down in the descent, I call moving from the mother's world to the father's world. Moving from the mother's world to the father's world. Now, you know, oftentimes the mother is comforting and so on, and the father, in the old way, stood for something harsh. I want you to do that. Mother said, well, he didn't have his clothes on, and I don't think he should have his rubbers on. And the father says, you know, come on, let's do it. That thing that calls you into a little harshness, it's often coming down through the male side of your family. Now, a good literary work on that is Hamlet. In the beginning of Hamlet, Hamlet's father comes to him and says, I got a harsh thing I want you to do. It's going to require ashes and grief on your side. Actually, someone murdered me, and I want you to pay attention to that. And Hamlet's blown away. He says, oh, how do I, can we have a test? Maybe you're not the right one, you know. Are you sure it's you? And all of that is he's so far in his mother world that he can't hear what the father asks him to do. And the father has to keep coming back in the grave all the time and say, wake up, for Christ's sake, you know. And he's there wrestling with his mother on the bed and accusing her of all kinds of stuff. Isn't that right? All these detours with the mother. Even anger at your mother for sleeping with someone, it's all a detour from being called into the Father's world. And it's a marvelous thing, that play. And you can watch him fighting not to go into the Father's world. And he doesn't want... One of the things it says in that story, if you are in a single family house and your mother is dominant and you want to move over to the Father's world, you will not get there unless you keep the trickster and the dark trickster with you. It's when Hamlet starts to send Rosencrantz to their deaths with a little joke, and he does a few little poison spears and shit like that, and stabs Polonius. Oh, you interrupt my conversation. This is okay. This is dark trickster stuff. And he moves along well, and if you don't have a father to call you, you're going to have to become the dark trickster, because that's how it moves. The dark trickster is able to move against the mother stuff, and she doesn't understand anything about it. You understand, I'm exaggerating and it's slow, but... Then, finally, at the end of the play, he hears his father's words. He moves to the father's world. He kills his father's murderer. His mother also dies. And then he dies immediately after. But nothing's perfect. I mean, if he started a little early, he might have lived longer. So nothing is promised here. Okay, so what we're doing here is talking about this situation in which after the feather has been picked up, that's not the end of your life. It's not the end of your movement either. There's going to come a time of weeping. And if you don't do the weeping, then the next thing the king tells you you can't do. Do you hear me what I'm saying? To go into this weeping, it's so the puer doesn't go this way, or we don't go this way. We go this, then we go and weep, then you come back, then you go into another time of ashes, right. Then you come back, then you go into another time of ashes. So that's all I have to say about ashes. That was good. Thank you. The question was, I've heard a lot of shots at therapists in this audience, in this meeting. And sometimes the response from the audience disturbed him, that they were sort of cheering these on. But we've all paid a lot of money, and anyway, and then he says, how can the therapist change in such a way to get more near what is being asked? Now, James is harder on the therapist than I am in this case, but he has a right to do that because he is one. And I think the therapy is extremely important for this going down into ashes material. And it may be that at a certain point you want to come up and join the community, but I believe it's very important to go inside yourself and allow yourself not to do outer work for a while to go down. James is worried because he's seen so many go down and not come up. And he said one time a lot of the great book reviews and political work that could have been done in the last 20 years have been exhausted in the therapist's room, where it's silent and never gets out. James, what do you say to him?
I think one has to be a lot more direct about actual therapy, a lot more direct, and to be a lot less concerned with, after these phases of going down, these ashen times, not to make therapy a business of ashes. Subjectivism, narcissism, and addiction, and codependency, all the syndromes that we see out there in the world are things that are going on right in the middle of therapy. There are other ways of being in the ashes, and there's also possible to be in the ashes and still be in the world.
Yes. And I think, moreover, that going down into the ashes and into the grief cleanses you in a certain way so that you can see the world and the world's suffering better and can come back with that.
And that your suffering is not only your suffering, and that subjectivism is what I'm attacking. Yeah. Your suffering is the world's suffering, and you're mourning lots of things besides your own childhood. Michael.
Two of the reasons, I think, to try and stir the waters of therapy. One is that often therapy takes the role of normalizing people, which can be a disaster. And then the other problem is therapy has gotten mixed up with ascensionist Christianity, so that you get this kind of filmy flying style with veils and with the crystals and that whole thing. And that gets to be difficult too, and the ashes get lost. And people forget the fact that the crystals were formed deep in the darkness of the earth over a long period of time and under great pressure.
That's good.
And of course, we're not saying that all therapists do that and therapy's bad. You know, hopefully we all know that it's a very meaningful thing and it's very important, and it comes from the old business of therapy, which meant to go into the temple of a god or goddess, to spend one's time there dreaming the other world, and the therapist was the one who interpreted or helped interpret the dream and helped position the person properly in the temple. It's a ritual activity. So, you know, I mean, we know that that's the root of it. We're just a little concerned with how it gets done sometimes when it moves towards normalcy or this flighty ascendancy.
Michael Meade talks about masculine energy, or litima, and the importance of male initiation. He follows with the middle section of the Firebird story.
The work of Joseph Campbell is unparalleled in modern times in terms of bringing up huge territories of mythology and of spreading that not only throughout this country but other cultures as well. But what happens, given our kind of our Christian turn, is the phrase that gets picked out of the whole thing is "follow your bliss." And as people say it, their eyes get bigger, and the word bliss, you know, rainbows appear and all this stuff happens.
It's like a new perfume.
Yeah, they're probably making it. You know, you pour it on. So what I want to do is take that phrase and put it next to something else of Joe Campbell's, which follows on Robert's ashes. This is early work of Campbell, his first book, The Hero's Journey. So that probably puts it in the late 40s. He's writing. And he says, "The tests, ordeals, and ultimate deed are to make the hero capable of enduring full possession of the mother destroyer, his inevitable bride. With that, he knows that he and the Father are one. He is in the Father's place." He's talking about mythology here, how the mother, the great mother, is the bride and the destroyer, and that to be a man, to be in the Father's place, is to have that marriage. He goes on. He then, you know, he's talking about the hero adventure and so on. And he says, in modern times, it's experienced through dreams and hallucinations in the office of the modern psychoanalyst, therapist, priest. And always after the thrills of getting underway, read Picking Up the Feather, the adventure develops into a journey of darkness, horror, disgust, and phantasmagoric fears. The crux of the curious difficulty lies in the fact that our conscious views of what life ought to be seldom corresponds to what life actually is. Generally, we refuse to admit within ourselves or within our friends the fullness of that pushing, self-protective, malodorous, carnivorous, lecherous fever which is the very nature of our organic cells. The follow your bliss is the first move. The rest of us goes on this path. And remember, they used to say ignorance is bliss. So it means follow your ignorance. On the same topic, Carl Jung. One doesn't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter is disagreeable and therefore unpopular. The one who flies closest to the light creates the biggest shadow.
Right. Hell yes.
Right? The child of the Savior is not saved. They have a whole bunch of old proverbs about seeking too much light. So I'm very interested in this lecherous, carnivorous, self-protected, pushing organic cells that seem to me very much connected to the whole business of desire. And it seems that what happens is these things are alight and alive in every child in the beginning. But it's extremely threatening to the family, and particularly to the parents, to have this being full of this exuberance, to use the old word for it, with all of the cells turned on and wanting to eat everything, even the unedible. And so it starts to get shut down right there. And that's not just true in this culture, that's true in a lot of cultures, although some cultures do better at it than maybe we're doing. But it is threatening within the family. At puberty, it seems to come back again with a big rush. And this would be one of the beginning times for initiation of young men. And I want to talk about it in relationship to men, or boys becoming men. And, biologically at puberty, there's a 30 times increase of testosterone. All of a sudden, suddenly, one day, it happens. The testosterone that is running in the body increases by a magnitude of 30 times. It's as if to say the firebird flies through the forest of the psyche of that boy. Everything else becomes quiet. This would be the second opportunity to embrace and honor the exuberance of this child man growing. Usually, in our case, again, because of the collapse of the mythological world and the fact that we're living outside of the shield of an active mythology, and as a result, we lose the rituals and we lose even memories of certain kinds because of that loss. This second exuberance is not honored, is not ritualized, is not deepened, is not blessed by the society, and certainly usually not by the family. So a second opportunity is lost. Pieces of it get done, or else we wouldn't be here. If pieces of us didn't get through those first two attempts at exuberance, we wouldn't be here, as James said earlier, amongst the survivors. But in tribal societies, there would be a focus to ritualize and further actualize more pieces than usually we get to experience, and that's one of the reasons why we feel alienated and at a great loss most of the time, and subject to huge rushes of anxiety. So I just want to talk a little bit about how it is done, or used to be done, because it's just about over. It's not just this culture, it's throughout the world. The loss of full functioning, mythologically based initiations for men is not a local cultural problem, it's worldwide. It's just about over. And I want to just mention some of the characteristics of how it was done and still is just barely being done in Kenya and Africa, amongst the Maasai and nearby, amongst other tribes nearby. And it's helpful to me because I kept looking back and saying, what was missed? What really was missed? And some of the modern words don't work for me. And so I wound up finding a liking for this foreign word. Because it's so foreign and unfamiliar to me, my own images can flow into it, maybe yours can too. And amongst these people in Kenya, it's called Litima, L-I-T-I-M-A. It's their attempt to name, more or less poetically, metaphorically, and mythologically, what it is that erupts in a male at this time of adolescence, and before that, but that is most noticeable at adolescence, and in a sense to honor it, and in a sense to learn something about it. So here's the definition of latima. Latima is that violent emotion peculiar to the masculine part of things, that is the source of quarrels, of ruthless competition, of possessiveness, of power-drivenness, and of brutality. See, they're not pulling any punches. But is also the source of independence, courage, upstandingness, wildness rather than savagery, high emotions, ideals, the movement toward individuation, and the very source of the desire for initiation. Did you get it? Okay. You see, they're positing two sides to this eruptive male quality. There's no doubt about men's constant, persistent, throughout history eruptions. Men are eruptive. I mean, the reason that football games happen is to somehow ritualize that eruptiveness. The reason that gang wars happen is because there is no ritualization in that place for this eruptive quality. Everybody remember the high school dances? And two boys or two groups of boys would somehow start, instead of dancing, working towards a battle. Usually, if it was a fairly healthy community, the young girls would encourage it. It's true. It's the job of young girls. After all, they're going to marry one of these guys. They want to see what he's got. I'm serious. What's lacking is the ritual frame, the ritual wrap for it, the older brothers to step in before someone is harmed or harm someone else, and the elders to come in and give the mythological meaning of that type of dance.
That's good. Right.
The scene is going to occur because, as James says, it's archetypal. That's not up to us. How it happens, the meaning of it, and whether it deepens the spirit and awakens the soul, that's our business. So I'll give the definition of latima again. Latima is that violent emotion peculiar to the masculine part of things. By that, they don't mean that women don't have it. They mean that it's masculine in tone. That is the source of quarrels, of ruthless competition, of possessiveness, of power-drivenness, of ambition, and of brutality. It's Campbell's lecherous carnivorous cells. But is also the source of independence. Jung said that individuation begins with Mars, with Ares. Also the source of independence, of courage, of upstandingness, the ability and the desire to stand up for something, as both Robert and James were talking about earlier. Take a political stand, take an artistic stand. The source of upstandingness, of wildness as opposed to savagery, of high emotions, the puers flying with emotions, of ideals. True idealism comes from the same place as brutality. Of ideals, of the movement towards individuation, and the source of the desire for initiation.
Now, if we agree that we have that and it isn't honored, wasn't honored in our family or in our community, what do we do?
Want to know what we do? I think the first thing is to realize when it's not honored, it's going to take the brutal path. The brutality of men is the untrained, eruptive emotion of men, you could say. The business of the initiation cycles and that whole thing. And by the way, the culture that has this definition, the initiation starts really at about 18 years of age and goes on till 30 years of age. It takes at least 12 years. It is not the initiation of boys in our sense. They're called boys until they finish this thing at about 30 years of age, and no boy or male in that society is allowed to marry until he's finished that whole 12-year cycle. And the reason is simple. They said, why would you put a man with or boy with untrained emotion into a little hut with a woman? You think she's going to improve him? No way. You think that it's not likely he's going to brutalize her? Big mistake. Of course, another great reason to be in groups of men is men always have gone into initiations in groups. Men do initiations in groups. In this particular type of culture, all the men enter at a certain age group as groups. That's actually this whole system of brotherhood and hunting together, and they're called out individually when the time is right for that man, when he has finished the process and the elders see the finishing of it in him, when he has a harness on his eruptive emotions and a polish on it, and then he's called out, and then he's brought to the women. And then marriage occurs, and what we call relationship goes on after that.
So therefore, what we're calling the soft male is the one that hasn't been activated at all, out of fear of the brutality.
Exactly. And often depression and reticence and hiding and lethargy is a actual kind of a moral decision not to erupt into the world and do damage to oneself or others. So we're going to go on.
And the horse of power had just said, that's enough grieving. The trouble is not now. The trouble is before you. And then he said to the hunter, go back to the king. Tell him that you need maize, good, dried, golden maize, and have the maize sprinkled all over the field that stands there beyond the castle, and have that done before morning. And then you and I will go there in the morning and we'll see what follows. So he went to the king. He asked for the maize. The king granted it. The maize was scattered all over the field, so that the field that was green turned yellow with the maize scattered about it. In the morning, just before the dawn broke, the hunter and the horse of power went to the field. In the center of a field was a huge old oak tree. The hunter dismounted and climbed up into the branches of the tree. And the horse began to wander about the field, nibbling on the maize. Just as the red orb of the sun rose above the horizon and cast its rays all about the field and the palace and the forest on the other side, a great noise was heard rumbling on the horizon. Where the sea was, the waves began to pile up one upon the other till the foam was driven into the air. In the forest, everything became quiet. A wind began to blow as if a tornado. It bent the branches of all the trees down. And following quickly behind the wind, there came the great flying firebird. It flew directly into the field, alighted on the ground, and began to nibble at the maize. Now the horse of power kept nibbling as well, and slowly inched itself a little closer and a little closer until it was right next to the great firebird. And then the horse of power lifted its iron hooves and pinned the wings of the firebird to the ground. Then the hunter jumped down from the tree. He brought with him 3 ropes. He threw each of the 3 ropes around the great firebird. Having wrapped it in the ropes, he went to the horse of power, climbed up on the horse, hauled the Firebird up behind him, and in that manner all three of them rode directly to the palace. They arrived in the courtyard. The hunter dismounted from the horse. He hefted the bird up onto his shoulders, went up the stairs into the great hall, and walked straight down the center of the great hall, slowly, step after step, the great Firebird laying across his shoulders, its golden wings hanging down so they looked as if the wings were coming out of the hunter himself. And as he walked across, golden feathers dropped out of the wings and fell all about the floor. In that manner, the hunter approached the king for the second time. He lay the great Firebird at the feet of the king, and the king thanked him, told him he had done a good job, gave him silver and gave him gold, and raised him in rank amongst the people. And then said, "You know, a man who could find, capture, and bring the great Firebird and lay it before me could surely go to the edge of the world, find the most beautiful woman in the world, the beautiful Princess Vasilisa, the one who my heart desires most of all things in the world, could certainly go and find her and bring her here to me. As a matter of fact, I desire that you do it. I request it of you. I require it of you. I command it of you. And one more thing. If you should fail to do it, at the sound of my blade, your head will roll from your shoulders." The hunter turned from the king and walked back down through the great hall, his head hanging down, his eyes looking at the floor, and copious tears falling from his eyes. He descended the steps from the great hall down to the courtyard where the horse of power was waiting. And the horse said, "O hunter, what has happened now that you grieve so heavily?" And the hunter said, "Well, I brought the Firebird to the king. He accepted it. He thanked me. He raised me in rank. He gave me gold. He gave me silver. And then he said that a man that could find a feather clearly could find the bird. And a man that could find the bird must be able to bring the beautiful Vasilisa from where she rides in her little boat in the sea at the very edge of the world. And I do not know where it is. And it sounds impossible." And once again he said, "If I fail, his sword will pass between my shoulders and my head. And I think it's my death I'm facing, and that's why I'm grieving." And the horse of power said, "Too much grief is not good for a man. Having grieved this much, it's better that you stop. Besides, the trouble is not now. The trouble lies before you. Now go back to the king. Tell him that you require a few things. Tell him that he must give to you the oldest of liqueurs, the most delicate and tasty of foods, and a tent made of silver with a dome of gold above it. And once you get those things, return back to me." And so the hunter went to the king. He asked for those things. The king readily gave it. He took the tent, the liqueurs, and the foods, went to the horse, mounted up, and taking those things, they set off for the edge of the world. And they traveled a short time, or a long time, or whatever time it takes to reach the edge of the world. And once they reached there, the horse stopped, the hunter dismounted. He took the tent and set it up at that place betwixt the land and the sea, at the shore where the dry thing meets the thing that is wet, where the green grass grows right up to the blueness of the ocean. He set the tent up there. Inside the tent, he arrayed the liqueurs, the goblets of silver, the goblets of gold, and laid out the daintiest and most delicate and tastiest of foods inside as well. And then, putting on himself his finest garments, he sat down in the midst of the tent with the flap open and facing directly towards the sea and waited. Now the beautiful Vasilisa was drifting as she was wont to do in her little boat of silver with her little golden oars in the blue sea right at the edge of the world. And as she was drifting, she noticed on shore this tent that shone of silver with a dome of gold, and she drifted in that direction. As she got closer, she could see on the circumference of the tent a series of pictures showing scenes from old legends and stories, and she drifted closer to look more carefully at those. Having come closer, she could see through the opening of the tent inside the young hunter sitting and arrayed in his finest clothes, and she drifted closer yet. Soon she found herself touching the shore. She easily alighted from the boat, walked towards the tent to look a little closer through the entrance. When she looked in, the young hunter beckoned to her, called her in, gave her a welcome, told her not to fear, asked her to sit down, poured her in a goblet of gold some fine red wine, poured some for himself, gave a goblet to her, lifted his own. They looked into each other's eyes, you know, the way a man will do and the way a woman will do, and each of them drank from the dark red wine. The princess, for her part, not being used to such strong liquors, found her eyelids coming down across her eyes as if the night itself was descending on her eyelids, and in a very short time she found herself sleeping deeply. The hunter did not wait. He took the tent down, packed it up, put it on the horse, picked up the princess, got onto the horse, turned the horse in the direction of the king's palace, and set off, the iron hoofs of the horse clamping across the ground as they hurried back on the path they had come. And in that fashion, they shortly arrived at the palace of the king, the hunter sitting on the horse, the princess Vasilisa laying in his arms as light as a feather. The horse stopped at the stairs before the great hall of the king. The hunter dismounted, carried the beautiful Vasilisa up the stairs into the great hall, brought her before the king, sat her down there. And the king thanked him, gave him things of wealth, raised him in honor and in rank, and said, it's time for a wedding. Let's begin the preparations. But the beautiful Vasilisa, for her part, began to weep. She began to cry about being so distant from the edge of the world and her boat of silver and her oars of gold, about being trapped in this strange place, and said she would not marry, she would never marry, she would never even consider being married. Or maybe on one condition. if someone were to bring to her the gown that was expressly made for her wedding. When asked where the gown was, she said, "That gown is in one place and in one place only. It is at the bottom of the sea, in the center of the sea, where the water is deepest and darkest, where there is a great rock sitting, and below that rock is where my wedding garments lie. And I will not enter a wedding or stop weeping until it is procured for me." And one more thing. It only seems appropriate that the man who captured me and carried me here should go to the bottom of the sea and retrieve my wedding gown. The king, for his part, added one more thing. He said, "And if you do not do what the princess requires, I guarantee you that the sound of the wind will be heard as that sword moves below your ears and above your shoulders." The hunter turned away and left the great hall, his head hanging down, his eyes looking at nothing but the ground below, and him wetting the ground with the tears falling from his eyes. He descended the stairs down to the courtyard and stood next to the horse of power, who of course said, "Oh, hunter, why is it now that you are grieving?" And the hunter told him the whole thing with the gown and the rock and the bottom of the sea. And the horse of power said, "Grieve no more. The trouble is not now. The trouble is before you."